call black everything. Everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we're happy to be joined today in the Left of Black studios with Professor Ali Colleen Neff, visiting professor of anthropology and African American studies at William & Mary College in Virginia. UNC grad, though we're not going to hold that against her. And at least in my case, Ali all grown up, as she over the last few years had been a TA of mine, so it's great to have you in the studio to talk about your work on women in Senegal and art. You've had an interesting trajectory in terms of your work as an ethnomusicologist. As a full-fledged graduate student, you know, where so many other of your peers are trying to figure out what their dissertation is going to be about and what they're going to write about, you published a whole book.
Right.
And did a film examining Southern hip hop. Talk a little bit about that first project, you know, looking at hip hop in Mississippi.
Sure. I want to say, as I begin, how excited I am to be here sitting with you, and how important your work was to me in those germinal days before I went to graduate school, imagining what a project in popular music studies might look like, what Black aesthetics can do in terms of global popular music studies. I mean, this is heavily influential work. And
I should mention that, you know, you're in town for the International Association for the Study of Popular Music in Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
So here you have this huge organization, both internationally and here in the U.S., that's really dedicated to this field of popular music studies. And there are a lot of folks who can't even wrap their head around what exactly that is.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so even when we have conversation, well, what is hip hop studies? You know, the fact that, you know, during the course of this weekend, going to hear papers on everything from, you know, Aretha Franklin to, you know, someone like Layla Hathaway, to any number of hip hop papers, to any number of indie rock papers. You know, what does it mean to do work in popular music studies?
Yeah, popular music is a special sort of a tuning fork by which we can pay very special, close attention to the material movements of global culture. Yeah. Popular music studies is a way that anyone who's interested in cultural studies can begin to pay attention to the specificities of commodities moving, to the specificities of sound and how it moves us, to the specificities of affect and the ways that we feel when we hear a song or when we are part of a crowd or when in that moment of improvisation and breaking away from the script. So I think that popular music studies is as powerful as it is because it gives us a special window by which we can understand the global movements of media and culture. And I think that when it comes to studying Black music and Black aesthetics, that's a responsibility that anyone who's engaged in popular music studies, in cultural studies, must attend to, because Black aesthetics and Black aesthetic studies have been attuned to questions of cultural movement, hybridization, improvisation, and the power, the special hidden powers of culture that other realms of cultural study just haven't.
And let me ask you this, you know, particularly since you're here, and I know this is something that we've talked about before. I think about my colleague up at Harvard, Ingrid Monson, the Quincy Jones professor, right, of Black music, and obviously, when you talk about writing about Black music, whether or not you're talking about hip hop in the South or in the case of your work now talking about women in Senegal, you know, there are always going to be folks who are going to look at you in context of doing this work and wonder where you belong in this space, right? And again, to clarify for the audience, right, as a white woman, you know, writing about Black music, I mean, what do you say to folks who have those kinds of questions?
It's tricky. I guess it's less about what I say than what I do and how I move.
It's about the work, right?
It's about the work, and it's about, you know, when I came to your office, when I first came to UNC and Duke, you were the first person I looked up. I came over to your office here in this building, in the John Hope Franklin Center, and walked in, and I said, you know, I don't even know how to approach these questions as a white woman studying this culture in the Black communities in the Mississippi Delta, but I'll tell you what, when I looked into the power of popular music, which absolutely has been such a force in my life in whatever form it's entered and mixed with my spirit, whenever I look into the power of that, I'm finding Black aesthetic practices at the core. And so I feel like I'm just following my responsibility and asking questions about the force of Blackness in global popular music, and that it's not a matter of disavowing that responsibility because I
disavowing who you are.
Or disavowing who I am and what I love.
Right.
That when I start asking critical questions about where musical creativity comes from, it leads me to the creative practices of young Black people globally in the Mississippi Delta, in the outer suburbs of Dakar, Senegal, in Oakland, California, and some of the communities I moved in there, in the juke joints of Newport News, in the Virginia Tidewater area. This is where creativity, in the playgrounds of junior highs across the country. I mean, this is where the natality of new musical movements are coming from, and that I'm only following my responsibility in doing research there. But at every step of the way, keeping myself present with the power differentials between me and the people I work with. And those move in tricky and complicated ways. And I can never deny the power of the women and the young people I work with and how they use that power to influence me as well. So it becomes a delicate dance and a conversation between me and the people I work with. And maybe my difference calls attention to that so that we can't pack it away and forget it. We have to constantly keep it in discourse.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined today by Professor Ali Colleen Neff, who is a visiting professor of anthropology and African American Studies at William & Mary College, talking about her work. You know, one of the things about working as an ethnomusicologist is that you really have to embed yourself in these communities. It's not the traditional kind of music journalism distance. You know, you had to embed yourself in the Delta. You had to embed yourself in Dakar. Talk a little bit about the work that you've done, your dissertation. After writing this great book, you know, for University of Mississippi Press, you know, you still had a dissertation to write, and you went abroad to do that work and embed yourself. So talk about the work that you've been doing recently. Sure,
yeah. I started off as a music journalist. That's what I did in my early 20s in San Francisco. I wrote for the San Francisco Bay Guardian and the SF Weekly, the East Bay Express, and I found myself, I'm a DJ and a practitioner, a turntablist, a real DJ, and I was working in record stores and practicing this, and I was on college radio, you know, throughout my early 20s and in San Francisco. And I found that the format of the 1,000-word or 2,000-word article wasn't letting me talk about the fullness of practice that this world of music was opening up for me. So I found myself wanting to trace specific threads of interest into the fullness of community practices. That's how I ended up in graduate school and doing deep, engaged ethnographic work in the Mississippi Delta. And by the time I was done doing this ethnographic research with young people in the Mississippi Delta and asking questions about where do new movements in hip hop come from? What of the blues in today's age? And who is practicing novelty? Who is practicing innovation in popular music? I found that not only was it the young people in these neighborhoods that are considered immaterial to global culture, immaterial to the American economy, that it's not only the young people, it's the women, the mothers, especially the choir directors, the teachers, the women poets, the girls practicing and killing it at the dozens in the schoolyard before they're admonished to stop, right? It's the young women, it's the young girls who are really creating these new forms of music, who are bearing these traditions, who are fostering innovations on these traditions. And so
I think about the work of Kira Gaunt.
Oh,
you know,
absolutely.
her groundbreaking work around Black girls and jump rope, and how she writes them into a broader musical narrative in ways that most folks would have just dismissed, right, as girls' games, right?
Oh yeah, and she continues to do cutting edge work, but that piece for me, The Games Girls Play, was a groundbreaking, it was a watershed moment. And I said, it is this coming from these women. And I had a moment in the Mississippi Delta where one of the young crunk artists, one of the young freestyle rappers I was working with, took me around to all of the places that have influenced him in his life. And place after place, it was these interiors in the Mississippi Delta, almost always trailers or little church houses or restaurants or kitchens where women were ruling these spaces that were his places of musical inspiration. And we ended up at the trailer of a woman named Miss Martha Rabin. And she was his church choir director, and she taught all the kids in the choir to improvise, to step out of the group and improvise their own rhymes, and how to catch the spirit and to come up with new melismatic riffs and turns and self-expressions that were very meaningful to them and very meaningful to the community. So it was her.
We hear these stories all the time, and R. Kelly's not the best example, but the stories that we hear about R. Kelly and his relationship with his choir director in high school, or his mother literally like putting Stevie Wonder's Hotter Than July album on and playing Master Blaster Jam and teaching him how to do those runs, right? Though very often, as you're suggesting, these women are written out of this larger trajectory.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah, or Dr. Dre's mom having him put on records during her house parties. Absolutely. And so I'm asking, okay, so where are these spaces of musical natality? Where are these moments, these sparks of creativity? And I'm finding that it's with women, particularly young women, and often women who have a special relationship to that global force of blackness, that global force of black creativity. And so when I began to ask questions about these spaces of musical natality, and I'm citing Fred Moten when I use that term, I began to ask about women who are the most often marginalized, I'll posit, people in discourses about globalization, and these are the women of West Africa. I decided to do, so after finishing my master's project on this, what ended up being a 4 or 5 year ethnographic project in the Mississippi Delta, which became a book, Let the World Listen Right, I decided to focus my PhD research in communication studies and media anthropology on the work of West African women vocalists. And I chose Senegal because the Senegambia region has a millennia-long tradition of women praise poets being the primary masters and mistresses of eloquence in that region. These praise poets being called griots in that region of Africa. So because these women are drawing from millennia of women's vocal practices, of women's poetry, of the conducting ritual, I wanted to see what was going on not only with women who continue to do these traditional rituals, but also young women pop artists who are drawing from these praise traditions. So I did that. I spent 2.5 years in the Dakar region of Senegal working with all women under the age of 25 who are professional singers and vocalists, from a young reggae artist who does a lot of work in Spain and Paris, to a group of 11 young women rappers called Gotal, who are freestyle artists who've been doing it since they were 15 or 16 years old, who are now professional 21, 22-year-old artists, to traditional praise poets, and especially young Sufi women praise singers who conduct Sufi ritual in the streets of Dakar.
You're watching Left to Black. We're here with Professor Ali Colleen Neff, who is a visiting professor at William & Mary College in the Departments of Anthropology and African American Studies, the author of a book called Let the World Listen Right, which is about hip hop in the Mississippi Delta, and artists in particular by the name of Top Notch in that space. One of the things I liked when we had the chance to work together is, and you were traveling, you would often bring back music for me to listen to. What are you listening to these days?
Oh gosh, one of everything. I mean, really, Beyonce's new album is probably the thing that's at the top of my playlist. I'm doing this project on the force of the oceanic and the figure of Mami Wata.
Talk about who Mami Wata is.
Mami Wata is a figure who arises in many different forms, from Yemaya throughout the Caribbean to a figure I named Madame Liquidator, a stage dancer for dance hall events in the Kingston, Jamaica area in the 1970s. She's a global figure who's more or less sort of a mermaid figure who pops up wherever water touches the rim of the Black Atlantic.
That's interesting.
So she emerges in all of these places, and what's really interesting is that the figure of Mami Wata arises again and again in the history of global popular music. So I sort of start with Beyonce's new album where she's enacting this Mami Wata figure. If you watch the videos, time and time again, she's arising from the tide, she's wearing costumes. She's this mother figure, this Mother Earth figure, Mother Water figure, arising from the ocean with her baby in her arms, or commanding the ocean to do her bidding as she rides it on her surfboard. So I start with her and I work backward to look at Nina Simone, a self-proclaimed Aquarius Pisces, who does a beautiful version of Take Me to the Water, where she breaks out in 15-minute dance. She was doing that at the end of the 60s, early 70s, to this new movement in sea punk, where sort of subaltern women, young women, electronica producers are making really innovative sounds and drawing self-consciously from the figure of Mami Wata and dressing like mermaids, Azalea Banks dressing like a mermaid. And I'm asking from which this figure of Mami Wata arises and what her relationship to pop formations are. So my thesis is that we can look at record charts and MP3 sales and genres and these sort of material collections or formations in popular music, but in between the cracks of these formations are the TLC's Don't Go Chase Some Waterfalls, are Aaliyah's Rock the Boat, our sea punk is Beyonce in, riding her surfboard. So these figures are arising again and again in the history of popular music, but not in a way that dominates it.
Right.
They don't grab the mic.
Right.
They sort of wait for the mic to be dropped and for everyone to clear the room so that they can sing in their own register, which has always been humming along.
We've been joined today by Ali Colleen Neff, assistant professor or visiting assistant professor at William Mary College in departments of anthropology and also African American studies. Thanks for joining us today, Ali, and
Thanks.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here. Thanks a lot.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.